At the farthest boundary of mapped commerce, beyond the reach of imperial taxation grids and outside the enforcement range of every recognized authority, there exists a star system that does not officially belong to anyone. A system that appears on every major navigation chart and yet is claimed by none. A place with no senate, no throne world, no military command, and no flag, and yet every major power in the Fractured Expanse depends on it, not for protection, but for continuity. Because in a region where borders shift with every conflict and contracts dissolve with every corporate collapse, there is only one location where agreements outlive governments, where trade continues through wars, where data flows even when fleets burn, and where access is valued more than territory. The charts call it a frontier node, the empires call it an anomaly, the corporations call it an unregulated liability, the insurers call it a statistical impossibility, the mercenary fleets call it neutral ground, the traders call it the axis of survival, and humanity calls it home. The system was never meant to become important. It possessed no habitable worlds, no pre-collapse megastructures, no alien relics that could be converted into strategic leverage. Only a dim star that barely illuminated the mineral-rich asteroids drifting through its gravity well. And the first human ships that arrived there were not explorers or pioneers, but vessels that had been pushed out of every recognized jurisdiction. Debt carriers fleeing asset seizure, refugee arcs denied planetary descent, independent extraction rigs whose corporate charters had been voided by conflicts occurring light years away, and they did not arrive as a fleet or a migration, but as isolated failures. And alone they would have died because no single vessel possessed the infrastructure to survive indefinitely in that environment. And so the first structure built in that system was not a habitat or a defense platform, but a dock, a rotating transfer scaffold welded into the surface of a hollowed asteroid and pressurized just enough to allow cargo exchange. And there was no government to regulate it and no authority to claim it. And so the humans implemented something older than empire and more durable than law. They wrote an agreement, a mutual access contract that defined fuel exchange ratios, labor valuation metrics, arbitration procedures, docking priority rules, emergency resource allocation, and most importantly, the permanent exclusion clause that denied access to any vessel that violated the terms. And this agreement was not stored in a central server that could be seized or destroyed, but copied into every ship that docked there, mirrored across independent data cores, transmitted along trade routes and embedded into navigation software, enforced not by police or fleets, but by the simple and absolute reality that in that region access was survival and exclusion was death. More ships came not because the system was wealthy, but because it was predictable. And predictability in the Fractured Expanse was more valuable than any resource because in imperial space, wars closed trade lanes without warning, and in corporate space, legal frameworks shifted with every acquisition, and in pirate-controlled sectors, access was dependent on tribute and intimidation. But in the human frontier system, the agreement did not change, and so traders began to root through it even when it extended their journey by several days because the statistical reliability of completing the journey increased by measurable percentages. And insurers followed because predictable environments reduced loss calculations, and data carriers followed because mirrored ledgers allowed real-time verification of cargo authenticity, and independent defense fleets followed not to conquer the system, but to guarantee that the network that depended on it would remain uninterrupted, and each arrival added not population, but connectivity, navigation updates, supply chains, emergency response packs, cross-sector credit recognition, and conflict de-escalation protocols in the system did not grow upward like a traditional colony, but outward like a web, a distributed structure that existed simultaneously in physical docking platforms and in contractual relationships spanning multiple sectors. And once that web existed, it became impossible to destroy without causing cascading economic collapse across every power connected to it. The first empire to conduct a formal survey classified the system as a minor economic curiosity and dispatched an evaluation vessel with a standard annexation assessment team. And they expected to find a fragmented leadership council that could be coerced into signing a compliance charter. But instead, they encountered thousands of privately owned docking nodes, every platform operating under independently authenticated contract clusters, every transaction recorded across decentralized ledgers, and there was no central authority to negotiate with and no capital to occupy. And the survey report concluded that territorial control was irrelevant because the system's value existed in participant access, and the participants were not territorially bound, and the empire marked the system as low priority and redirected its expansion fleets toward regions where conquest produced immediate and measurable tax revenue. Over the next 3 decades, the frontier node transformed from a survival dock into the most reliable logistical hub in the sector, not because it had been designated as such, but because it never closed. Because when 2 empires went to war and their border checkpoints collapsed, their supply convoys rerouted through the human system, and when corporate enforcement fleets blockaded competitor markets, their subcontractors moved their cargo through the frontier under neutral arbitration. And the humans did not take sides and did not issue declarations and did not field warships to defend their sovereignty. They sold continuity, and continuity in the fragmented political environment was more valuable than any victory, because a fleet that wins a battle still requires fuel and repair and verified cargo manifests. And the only place where those services could be guaranteed under any political condition was the frontier node. Eventually, the trade volume passing through the system exceeded the fiscal output of entire imperial provinces, and annexation was no longer a matter of territorial ambition, but of economic necessity, and an administrative occupation fleet was assembled with the stated objective of integrating the system into the imperial taxation framework while maintaining operational continuity. And the fleet arrived in perfect formation and broadcast jurisdictional authority in every recognized diplomatic channel and established customs grids and regulatory docking protocols. And for the first time in its history, the frontier system stopped moving. Ships held position outside docking range. Cargo transfers ceased. Encrypted data channels went silent. And then in a sequence defined by contract exit clauses, every participant disengaged and rerouted to secondary nodes that had been pre-mapped for exactly such a contingency. And within hours, the Empire held physical control of the system and absolute control over nothing, because the trade routes had moved and the insurance networks had reclassified the system as a conflict zone. and the independent defense fleets had withdrawn their continuity guarantees, and the cost of maintaining the occupation fleet began to exceed the total projected revenue from taxation within a single fiscal cycle. And the longer the fleet remained, the greater the economic damage to the surrounding sectors that depended on uninterrupted trade. And after 14 standard days, the annexation was classified internally as a strategic miscalculation, and the fleet withdrew without formal acknowledgement of failure. In the centuries that followed, multiple powers conducted simulations on how to control the human frontier system, and every model produced the same result. Territorial occupation destroyed network participation, and network participation was the only source of value. And so the system became the only location in the Fractured Expanse, protected not by treaties but by mutual dependency, and its doctrine evolved into a form of control that did not rely on defense fleets or sovereignty claims, but on indispensability. Because the humans did not fortify their star, they embedded themselves into the economic structure of every surrounding power, and something that every system requires cannot be eliminated without causing self-inflicted collapse. And so the frontier developed a cultural identity that rejected centralized authority, not as ideology but as function, because any central authority would have created a point that could be seized or negotiated with. And instead, governance existed as layered arbitration networks, rotating contract councils, and access-based reputation systems. And children born in the rotating habitats grew up memorizing the original agreement, not as law, but as survival protocol. And traders from imperial corps spoke of the frontier in the same tone used for ancient pilgrimage sites, because it was the only place where the galaxy's fragmentation temporarily ceased and continuity existed. Now the system is visible from across the sector as a hollowed asteroid illuminated by constant traffic. Thousands of docking arms extending like spokes from a rotating core. Cargo lanes defined by synchronized navigation beacons, and no warships in permanent orbit, because warships would imply sovereignty, and sovereignty would imply vulnerability. And at the center of the structure there remains a chamber that contains the first agreement, expanded through centuries of amendments but unchanged in principle. Access in exchange for continuity, participation in exchange for neutrality, survival in exchange for cooperation. And this is why human frontier systems are never invaded, not because they are strong, but because they are necessary, not because they cannot be conquered, but because conquest removes their value, not because they defend themselves, but because they make themselves indispensable. And in the Fractured Expanse, where every empire measures power in fleets and territory and taxation, there exists a single system that measures power in access, and access cannot be bombarded, cannot be blockaded, cannot be annexed, because access is a decision made by participants, and participants can leave, and networks do not surrender. They reroute, and as long as the agreements continue to be honored, the frontier will exist without borders, without rulers, and without armies. And every ship that docks there, whether imperial, corporate, independent, or unknown, will acknowledge the same truth, that in a galaxy defined by control, the only true power is continuity, and continuity belongs to humanity, and the transmission continues.